In this video, we'll be using trigonometry to determine a missing part of a right triangle. The primary focus of this video is actually to help you develop a strategy for actually setting up the equation to solve. So here we go. There's essentially a general format to set up every equation to solve a right triangle. First part is a trigonometric function, followed by the acute angle, followed by an equal sign, and then followed by the ratio of two sides. I'll get more specific. When I speak about the trigonometric function, primarily it'll either be sine, cosine, tangent. Now the other three, secant, cosecant, and cotangent, could be used, but the primary ones are the ones we'll focus in on, the sine, the cosine, tangent. Major reason why is because ultimately we will be using a calculator, and sine, cosine, tan are the buttons on the calculator at our disposal. Next, the acute angle will either be an unknown quantity, theta, or an actual angle amount. Of course, the little equal sign, and then the sides will either be the opposite, the adjacent, or the hypotenuse. Here's a couple examples. Cosine 15 degrees equals a over 23. Cosine, there's a trigonometric function, 15 degrees, the acute angle, the equal sign, and then the ratio of the two sides. Specifically here, this is the adjacent, that's the hypotenuse. How do I know that? Because we're using cosine. Cosine is the ratio of adjacent over hypotenuse. Another example, tan theta equals 3/4. Tan is the trigonometric function. The theta represents the acute angle. Obviously, in this case, the acute angle is an unknown quantity. Therefore, we use the theta. The theta symbol is similar to using a variable when we don't know a sign. The 3 and 4, that's the ratio of the two sides. 3 represents the opposite side, 4 represents the adjacent, because tangent is opposite over adjacent. Next example, sine 38 degrees equals 15 over c. Sine is the trigonometric function. 38 degrees is the acute angle. Notice I'm not just saying angle, the acute angle, because again, in a right triangle, we have the right angle and two acute angles, followed by the equal and the ratio of two sides. Here, the 15 represents the opposite, while the c represents the hypotenuse. I know that because of the trig function sign. All right, so now I'll give you some steps on actually creating these equations. So steps for setting up a problem involving trig functions. Step 1 is to identify the acute angle referenced in the problem. You will see specifically, that's the first thing you want to look for, is the angle that's being referenced in the problem. Next, you'll name the sides based off of the referenced acute angle. So the sides will either be the opposite, the adjacent, and the hypotenuse. Now, of course, the hypotenuse is always the hypotenuse. It's the opposite and the adjacent sides that will change based upon which acute angle has been referenced. Step 3 says determine the trig function. Now that you've identified the sides used, those two sides will determine which trig function you will which trig function you will use. Step 4, you'll substitute all what you just determined from the 3 previous steps into the general format. Trig function, acute angle, equals the ratio of two sides. And the last step is to actually solve for the unknown. So I've got a couple sample problems to consider. Determine the length of BC, round to the nearest tenth. Okay, step 1 says determine the acute angle reference. So here we're working with angle B. And I know that because that's the only acute angle that has any amount reference. So step 1, is 13 degrees. That is the acute angle being referenced. Step 2 says, now name each of the sides we're working with. Well, we're working with the A and the 29 inches. Side A is adjacent to angle B, and the 29 is the hypotenuse. So A is the adjacent, the 29 inches is the hypotenuse. Step 3 says, now take these two sides and begin to create your trig function. Well, adjacent over hypotenuse, that's the trig function cosine. And then hypotenuse over adjacent is secant. So we use these two sides, create the ratio, and that will dictate the trig functions. Here the recommendation is to choose the one that's on the calculator, cosine. We could choose secant, but it'll be a little bit more involved to get to our answer. Step 4 says put it into the general format. Trig function followed by the acute angle equals the ratio of sides. So we already determined we're going to use cosine as our trig function. Step 1 told us the acute angle, 13 degrees. There's the equal. And step 3 showed here's the ratio we're using. Adjacent, which is A, hypotenuse, which is 29. And now step 5 says go ahead and solve it. So A is being divided by 29, so we'll multiply 29 on both sides. 29's cancel, left with 29 cosine 13. That's what goes into the calculator, leaving me with 28.3 inches. Because it said round to the 10th, that's why it's 0.3. All right, let's try one more example. Determine the measure of angle E. Round to the nearest degree. So step 1 says determine the angle you're working with. Determine the acute angle. In this case, it's angle E. How do I know that? Because in the question it says determine the measure of angle E. So we're not working with F. So angle E. Step 2 says let's look at the sides. Well, we're working with the 31 feet and the 23 feet. Well, the 31 feet is opposite angle E, while the 23 feet is adjacent. Because this side here, the longest, is always the hypotenuse. So we're working, there we go, the 23 feet, which is adjacent, and the 31 feet, which is opposite. So step 3 says, let's go ahead and create our trig function. So we take the two values, we got opposite and adjacent, which just happens to be tangent, and adjacent over opposite, what happens to be cotan. And again, out of the two, we're going to select the ones that's easier, which is on the calculator, tangent. So step 4 says go ahead and put it in the general format. Trig function, tan, acute angle, angle E, equals the ratio of the two sides. Well, we chose opposite over adjacent. Opposite was 31 feet, adjacent 23 feet. So step 5 says go ahead and solve. Right now, the unknown is being tangented, if you will. So we have to inverse tan on both sides. The tans cancel, leaving me with measure of angle E is equal to inverse tan 31 over 23. Type this straight into the calculator, round it accordingly to the nearest degree, 53 degrees. So hopefully this helps you as we move forward.